everyone, and welcome to WTF World, our show where we like to talk about what's going on in the world in a non-divisive way when possible. That's our vision. And joining us from the studio is John with the headset and Dirk from an undisclosed location in Nevada, or Nevada. And
Nevada.
Nevada. And we have some amazing special guests today. Gabby Jubran, who is a dear friend of mine and also a social entrepreneur who creates spaces for people to experience meaningful connections with one another. And I'll let him share a bit more about his work and what he's into in a minute. And also, I'd like to introduce Allison Abigail Raymer. Is that the right way to say that?
Yeah, that's right.
Wonderful. She is a political strategist and the founder of Social Change Studios, and she lived and worked in the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel for 15 years, supporting the establishment of several Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations and working with international humanitarian and development organizations. We are so excited to have you both on today. And I'll let you take it from here if you'd like to share a little bit about your work and anything else that you feel inspired to start off our conversation.
Great. First off, thank you. Thank you for having us. Thank you for the invitation, Rachel. I can share a little bit more about my background. I am actually born to Palestinian parents. My father is actually half Egyptian and half Palestinian. He was born in Jerusalem in 1943, and at the age of 5, during the Nakba, or the Israeli War for Independence, um, he was made to leave his home, and my father and his family settled down in Bethlehem, where they ran a family business of carving figurines out of olive wood to support themselves. And my mother was born in Bethlehem, both Christian Palestinian parents, which is within the minority. And her father's side of the bloodline goes back to Bethlehem for thousands upon thousands of years. And we actually suspect that her father's side could actually be the original Jewish people of that land and converted to Christianity when Jesus came about. And a lot can change in one generation, I recognize. My parents left Palestine. They left Bethlehem in the 70s to move to Kuwait for more economic opportunity to be able to support their family. And then my family got an opportunity to move out to the Bay Area of California in the mid 80s. And I was born shortly thereafter. So I'm the first generation of the first generation to be born in these lands and in a multicultural kind of background. And yeah, I have a challenging experience of trying to figure out how these worlds could mix in a way in which I felt like I wasn't being pulled in multiple directions. Really trying to figure out where I belong and what does home even actually mean for me, because I didn't feel connected to necessarily my ancestral homelands, and my parents weren't physically connected with it anymore. We do have some relatives in the West Bank area, and a lot of them in Jordan. So I'll give some brief context on that. With my family who was in Kuwait during the Gulf War, I believe the Palestinian people supported the Iraqis, and so they were actually made to leave Kuwait, and Jordan took them in. And so Jordan is predominantly Palestinian and Syrian refugee. There are very few actual Jordanians that live there at this time. And yeah, coming back to this idea of belonging and home, and what does home feel like? I feel like I was always trying to fit in, to adapt to different spaces and scenarios that I was in. And it took me a while to really come more fully into who I am not just these different identities and aspects of myself, but who am I, and how do I show up in the way that I only can in the world. And that's been a big journey for me the last 7 years, and part of that has looked like um, having a deeper connection with my ancestral roots, beginning to actually reclaim my mother tongue, like remembering and learning how to speak Arabic more fluently, and learning how to cook some of our cultural dishes. And part of my way of connecting with Allison along this journey was through a mutual friend of ours. And I was like, yes, I would love to meet this person. I'm in this space of like really trying um, to connect with something that is a big part of me that's been dormant, at some level, something that I've been a little numb to, or felt disconnected from, because at some level of my privileged existence here in the Bay Area, but also because I know that there's at some level a lot of pain there and a lot of things that I'm not looking at. Um, and yeah, it feels like as Allison and I have gotten to know each other much, much better this year, it feels like it's been kind of preparing us for this kind of moment that we're in right now. And just to share a little bit more, and I'm sure Allison will share more, part of what has emerged out of that is that we've been hosting collective mourning spaces together to mourn the loss of life, again, in a non-divisive way, beyond binaries of us versus them and victims and perpetrators. And that's been a really healing experience for me. I know it's something that I wouldn't necessarily make time for unless it was like scheduled into my life. So um, yeah, I have a lot more to say, but um, I guess one little additional piece I'll add in here is within the context of the work that I do. I run a nonprofit called Happy, which is an acronym helping awesome people prosper intentionally. And the mission is to cultivate healthy communities and cultures in which people and planet can prosper. And a lot of that looks like creating spaces for people to feel at home. So even if I can't necessarily have this connection to place in the same way, I often find home through people and through groups of people that I am able to create culture with. And to me, the kind of the core piece and part of, and we'll talk about it more, but like part of the medicine of this time to me um, is creating opportunities and spaces for people to be themselves while belonging and contributing to something bigger than themselves. And so even today's show is an expression of that.
It's so nice to have you with us and sharing your perspective, which is incredibly, I think, as unique as all, all of our individual perspectives, but it's amazing um, to immigrate here actually, and still, I'm more than a few generations out in the closest from coming here, and it's a lot of those things like cooking the food, singing the songs, learning the language are too far away sometimes to grasp, and so it's really special that you can actually reconnect and that it's not so far back.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure that makes this time really even more challenging. Yeah. Yeah. Allison, I'd love to hear a bit about your work in the world too and what you're up to and anything you'd like to share to start.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm really resonating with what Gabby talks about in regards to the experience of assimilation. And I am from my family lineage, on one side, I'm a 15th generation American settler whose family came as mercenaries and missionaries to Turtle Island, to the United States. And on the other side of my family, I'm the fourth generation of Jewish refugees who came from the pogroms in Eastern Europe. And in carrying these lineages, I think also I was really searching for belonging in my life, and dealing with the burden and the horrible reality as a young person that I am a part of, and I've been born into a project of settler colonialism. And that recognition made me look to see where could I go and what could I do that would lessen that. And I think there's also the knowledge of US imperialism in the world and the pain of being in the belly of the beast and seeing the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War and the failed anti-war movements that really made me think that I should go somewhere else. And so when I was 19 years old, I traveled with Birthright Israel, which is a Zionist organization that recruits young people to Israel from around the world. Hundreds of thousands of young people have gone on these trips, 10-day tours that the government and US Jewish philanthropists have sponsored. And they really, they show you their narrative and their story, and they invite you to be a settler. They invite you, and they will never say that, but they invite you to have, free education, to have support for living in the country, a lot of different, jobs in high tech, a lot of different things. And as a young person, I thought that it was a compelling endeavor to at least to spend time to deeply understand what Israelis were calling for, as they were calling for us to come together in the state of Israel as Jewish people. So I immigrated there, and I spent 5 years living in Tel Aviv. I was working in social change work, starting like a hub for social entrepreneurs. I was acquainted and close to a wide variety of people, some who had, served in the army, many who had served in the army, many who had refused, some few who had refused or found ways not to go to the army, Arab Jews and Ashkenazi Jews, and just a lot of different people. And I learned the language, and I started to be able to look at the media and to see what was happening on a deeper level. And during Operation Cast Lead in 2008 and 2009, I was in Israel, and I watched how Israel denied journalists access to Gaza, how the messaging and the information that was on Israeli television and Israeli media, which there are often censorship from the government, was not covering any of the human losses of life in Gaza, and was telling a very different story than what you would find in Al Jazeera or in outlets where Arabic speakers are, and their work is being shared. So I recognized that there was a lot of discrepancy, and I needed to understand deeper what was the situation. So I was invited by a I was invited when I was working at Haaretz to go and cover a small demonstration that had started in the West Bank, and it had started against settlers who had overtaken a freshwater spring on the community's land. And it was their second demonstration when I arrived, and they have had hundreds since. And just coming and seeing the scene for my own eyes and I decided to take a month and to interview soldiers and settlers and Palestinians. And very quickly, within, just a few meetings and a few days of spending my time there, I recognized that the soldiers were provoking violence, the settlers were lying, and the Palestinians really needed support to do public relations. So I stopped doing my work and I also saw journalists and how journalists were covering it, and how they would not really tell any of the deeper stories that were really necessary to understand the complexity of the situation, and just cover very surface level kind of aspects. So I decided to leave my work as a journalist, and I moved to the West Bank, and I started supporting this small community of Nebi Saleh, as well as several other communities, Al-Walaje and Silwan, throughout the West Bank, and in telling their stories and sharing it with the world. And I thought as activists, that was like the thing to do, you know? This was the beginning of the time of Facebook and social media. And I worked also with World Vision, a child rights organization, to give children cameras and help them to share their stories. But what happened was very unfortunate, and to someone older and wiser would have been foreseen, which is that when these people raised their voices, they became targets. And all of the children in my photography classes were abducted and tortured while I was conducting the classes. So, and just this week, there's ongoing arrests that are constantly happening that are designed to systematically fray the Palestinian society and psychology, and to create a generation of people who feel that resisting in nonviolent ways is useless. And it was very clear. It was very clear. So, that led me to a decade of work, and I'm back in the United States, after establishing several sustainable programs and organizations in leadership, in psychosocial support and psychology, and in advocacy, human rights. So the real one of the key problems, and then I'll turn it over back to you, is just one of the key problems is that the US, what is happening in the US and the Western governments and their power and how they're enabling this situation. And so it was very clear to me after all of those years that I really needed to come back to the United States and to be supporting a struggle amongst people here in the United States who are funding these atrocities and this ongoing systematic oppression.
I did have one question to ask you. You were talking about the journalist earlier, and they weren't really telling the story. Was it because of their own prejudices, or was it because they were afraid they would be censored, or a combination of those things?
So most of the journalists I was talking about were international journalists. Those were the ones that I was witnessing working for the AP or for Reuters. And, and then of course, over time, we really worked to bring like much more diverse journalists to that village. And we had incredible coverage by, that village is super famous now. It's the village of Bassem and Ahed Tamimi. Ahed Tamimi is probably the most famous international young activist now. She was arrested 2 nights ago in her home for a post that with the charge of incitement for a post that showed up on an account that isn't even hers, but which uses her name. And she was imprisoned and her mother was imprisoned for incitement after a soldier shot her cousin in the head and then charged her. She slapped him, and it's known as the slap heard round the world. And it went, viral on social media, and she was imprisoned for nearly 2 years for this incident. Israel is the only country in the world. She was 16 years old. Israel is the only country in the world that tries children in military courts. And there are hundreds of children who are held now and are held on an annual basis in Israeli military courts with also, as I said earlier, with many accounts of torture. So there's a huge child rights crisis. But just back to the bit about the journalists, I think that for me at that time, getting a feature story instead of just covering the news is very different. And even just covering the news, I saw so many times that it was not accurate reporting. Even from the best journalists. And the truth is that most of the international journalists who go through there do not have a deep depth of understanding of the place. It is the journalists who have lived and worked there for a decade who understand and who can explain the complexity to the world. But many other journalists are just, kind of on a bucket list of places that they want to cover.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so, I think what you just shared is so detailed and also so complex that I don't even know where to start. that you've had that experience. John, do you have a question?
Yeah, for both of you, what is the goal of what you're actually doing, of what you're trying to accomplish? What is your end look like?
Within the context of our work, or as in our partnership with each other, as
No,
like
in your
collaborators?
work, and you know, just for example, for being here on this show, what do you hope comes out of it? What are you looking to see as a result, not only from this, but from your work and your perspectives? Either one of you.
Yeah,
I can start.
please.
I mean, we are doing the work that is, I think my internet maybe slowed down a little bit. Sorry. But yeah, can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
This is an answer to people's prayers. Speaking about this, sharing what is happening in the world from our firsthand experience, which is very different, and which there is, the reason for that asymmetry is really painful, actually, to go into. The fact that I do not have any ancestors who have lived in Israel, Palestine for as long as there is record, and I can live there and have full rights in Israel and in the occupied territories, and Gabby cannot. And so I think being here together is also a way of showing people the asymmetry, showing people the complexity, and telling our stories so that, people who can understand that assimilation, we have both experienced assimilation. We've both experienced losing language and, assimilating into the white culture to survive. And it feels also very different for us. Jewish people are accepted as a part of the white culture, and brown people and Palestinian people and people of color are not. And so while I get to pass and have tremendous amounts of privilege in the world, like, Gabby doesn't have that same experience. And so I think part of being here together is not about saying, oh, look, we can get along. It's about, like, we have to resist together for everyone's liberation. I will not be safe from anti-Semitism. Gabby will not be safe from anti-Arab racism or from Islamophobia or any of those things, until we can really resist this together. And we're resisting white supremacy. We're resisting nationalism. We're resisting a lawless world without international law. So I think we're here to show that to people and to give them a chance to, be with our grief, honestly, our tremendous grief.
I can really appreciate that, because that's kind of like racism in this country. And we always tell people, Black people can't just cure racism by themselves. White people have to recognize it's their problem, their issue, and they have to do something about it, and we will support them. And this sounds like pretty much the same thing.
Yeah. I think that's well said, Derek and Allison. Thank you. And I haven't heard it expressed by you in that way, so thank you as well, John, for that question. It felt good to receive that.
Well, that's part of why this show is happening, is to bring people from diverse backgrounds together and show that we all have the same things in common. And until we put behind us the hundreds and hundreds of years of bullshit, we're not going anywhere. It's just going to continue to be the same thing day after day after day. And whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Southeast Asia, whether it's in the Southern United States or whatever, someone somewhere somehow has to just say, all right, that's enough, guys, let's move on. Let's go forward, and let's forget looking back. Anyway, that's just my opinion. So,
well, I think one of the really interesting things about all this, though, is that if you have as your goal an attempt to elevate humanity. If you have as your goal the goal of making yourself a better person, then it doesn't make any difference where you live or what you believe in or whatever. You have to start looking at things in a different way. And we as Americans, we don't know what's happening over there, but we don't want people to suffer. We do want there to be peace. And so you can't take sides. You have to look at things in a totally different perspective, because taking sides doesn't really help anything. It makes things a little bit more complicated. You have to be able to look at it in terms of humanitarianism, and that changes everything.
I think one of the things that we miss when we're looking at situations like this is that what we're seeing, what we're talking about, what we're experiencing are side effects. And we never really get to the root cause of all of this, all the crap that's going on. All we see are the side effects, and that's what we're reacting to on a daily basis. That's what we base our opinions on. That's what we base our beliefs on, are the side effects. Looking at the Middle East, I mean, how far back do we go to say, oh, okay, well, here's the moment when it all started? Because none of us can remember that. And I mean, it's just been, and that's just one example. I'm just using that because that's what we're talking about. But it's just, what is the root cause? How did we is there something we can do to correct that root cause or ensure that it doesn't happen again? And that's my point.
Yeah, I mean, I could say a little bit on this as just a concept, and what you all shared is just like, my mother's Jewish. I consider myself Jewish in that context. And I've also never lived in Israel. Our family's never lived in Israel, but I also could go back there. My father is, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and just them coming together is special within me. There's kind of like two sides of things exist. And I feel like for all people, whether or not we remember, at some point, our culture was assimilated. Like whether it was like Celtic people, whether it was rural people, like, different religions have come into our countries and taken over and assimilated us long before we can even remember. And some of us, we remember, but I don't think it's foreign. I think it's happened to like all people almost at some point in time or another, one religion or another, one warlord or another. And I think it's common to the poor, to peasants, to people who aren't rulers, to have had this happen to us over and over again. And when we consider ourselves part of the country that's doing it, like, the US is funding Israel, I don't think in terms of, I think, people dying is a casualty to large world domination, militaristic control, economic control, democratic, pushing our type of government, whatever type of government. Like, I think there's big things on the world level that are happening that little people aren't really a part of. Like, we just feel the cost, and we're kind of held up as like, it's you doing it. And I actually think that like the poor, the most of the world, the 99% of all the people are the victims. And world domination and resource domination is something happening in the world, and that normal people are the casualty. And so I just, I think that in this case, probably a lot of that is also happening. And I don't know, feel free to join in and share. That's just my thoughts at the moment too. Like, yeah, what do we do? Why is this happening? And
well, I think part of why it's happening is because we don't take responsibility. We actually think that we are the victims, but we have access to our basic human rights. So in the way the global system is operating, we are not victims of that.
When you say we, you are referring to?
Like in the United States, for example, we are not the same as the Palestinian people. We are not the same there's a difference, and it's important to acknowledge that we have this difference. And I don't think we can dismiss history. I also think we are responsible to understand the origins of the Western thinking that have led to the idea that we can dominate and assimilate other people. And we have to work on understanding and knowing that. And there are people in the world who understand and know that, and who are scholars and who can share those teachings and understanding of how private property, like you said, the idea of conquering a land, taking those people and assimilating them into your religion or your nation or whatever, that has origins, and we must know the history to address it and to deal with the repercussions of that and to not be repeating it. So we can't put behind the thousands of years of history. We actually have to know it. And it's very difficult to know it for a lot of people. We are peasants still today in many senses, but there are people who know it in our societies, and we need to listen to those people. We need to listen to scholars, and we need to, and we also have to recognize that it's important to know many different opinions and many views of this, so that we can be engaged and be taking decisions and taking our responsibilities. There's no way that there's nothing any of us can do. That's just not true. So we really have to learn how can I be responsible and have support for that. And I think in my work, that's what we're trying to do. In Gabby's work, we're trying to do is actually, you can have a way to be responsible and ethical in the world. There is a way of learning and relating and doing and choosing to work in your life. So
I'm actually really glad you brought that up, because that's one of the issues that we talk about on our show all the time, which is education, knowing the history. If you know the history, then you can perhaps do something about it. At least you have a starting point. Unfortunately, there's two groups of that. There's a group that feels that way, and then there's a group that says, yeah, we know the history, but if we let everybody else know the history, they might get mad at us, or they might stop us from doing what we want to do. And that's why you have so many people that are against education, against teaching people how to read, against them learning their history. And it doesn't matter what country you go to, United States, the Middle East, it doesn't make any difference. There's always going to be somebody out there that says, we don't want these people to be educated, because if they're educated, then they're going to have a whole lot different opinions than what we want them to have. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, I am too. And I think it gets into not only we don't want people to see this, but let's create more misinformation and disinformation and propaganda and spread that out so that people are confused and don't know what is actually real information, and don't have necessarily the education and media literacy to be able to sift through any of this information. And so it can leave somebody feeling like, well, all I can focus on is what's in my family, or my, whatever it is that I have immediate view into.
I'm kind of glad you brought that up too, but when you think about it, the more of the history that you understand, the easier it is to discount the misinformation, because you've seen it before. Right. That's part of the system. That's what they're going to use. And so it makes it easier for you to look for what's real and what's not real.
Right. Yeah. Pattern recognition. Absolutely.
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'll just share one quote with regards to education, and coming back to your question, John, about what am I, part of what I'm hoping to get out of today's conversation, or just in my work in the world, is there's been a lot of talk about peace, but there's also been an increased amount of talk about, well, there can't actually be peace without liberation and justice. And there's a great quote with regards to education by a Brazilian man named Paulo Freire, who wrote a famous book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And the quote is, when education is not liberating, the dream of the oppressed is to become the oppressor. And so from my perspective, it's if I've been programmed to think that power over, that domination, that supremacy is what success looks like, and I've been oppressed my whole life, well, then my my dream is to then figure out how to be that power over another. And I really believe that we talk about liberation of Palestine, and again, kind of Dirk, what you were saying before about racism and liberation of Black people. It's when we liberate these people, it helps free everyone. It is, like, I think a really critical point. It's not as though people who want freedom and want peace are going to then turn everything around and become the oppressor again. I think when people center liberation and freedom, peace will naturally ensue from that.
I want to jump off from that point. Too many people around the world want that freedom, but they want it for themselves. They don't give a shit about you. As long as I have what I want, then I don't care about this one or that one or this one, because I'm comfortable. I have what I want, you know, and all I care about is who's going to be on Dancing with the Stars this Sunday. You know, that's and that's, I mean, you laugh, but there's a whole lot of truth to that. And then,
well, it's funny because as Gabby was talking, I was thinking to myself, there's a lot of people that might look at a certain situation or a certain group of people and say, you know, I really wish that I could do something to help them out. But because those people are associated with these people that I don't like, whatever.
Yeah, they wouldn't appreciate it anyway, you know.
Right.
So
right.
that kind
so
of thing. Yeah.
They don't put much effort into it because, you know, it's almost like we used to talk about with Trump people, you know, it's like they hate the same people I hate.
Right.
Kind of that kind of thing. And
whether it's founded or not, it's just
right.
You know, that's anyway, that goes too far. Now, I do have one question for you, Gabby, and I'm glad that I have a chance to ask someone this question because I've never had the opportunity. What is a political strategist?
Wow. This is
I mean, I hear that, you know, on the news all the time, you know, political strategist, blah, 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 blah. So what the hell is that? I mean, is that something that you, you know, you go to school for? Or no, I'm being a little facetious, but I was just curious, you know, what your definition of a political strategist might be.
I feel nice, like, John, because I have a degree in political science, man. Don't start talking shit.
I feel like, given Allison's background, this is actually more definitely in her court in terms of like a more nuanced and well thought out perspective of it. You know, I can play the game of politics within the context of what I'm in, but like in terms of a strategist, an overarching strategist, I'd love to hear Allison's perspective.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I also, Allison, when you get finished, I would like for you to take that and kind of move into the situation that's going on in Gaza right now and tell us your perspective on that too.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I think political strategist could mean a lot of different things in different contexts. For a long time, I think I've been a human rights defender and a human rights advocate. But I work strategically with people on how, and organizations and institutions, about how do they orient themselves politically. And my expertise, as you well have guessed or know, is about Israel-Palestine, about Zionism, about nationalism, and about existential risk. I also worked a lot on technology, and I advised Meta in their human rights approach, you know, as a political, as a human rights strategist specifically, you know. So I hope that answers a little bit more of your question. But I really do want to talk about what's happening in Gaza. Where do we begin? I mean, there are so many. I think it's important really to move out of the framework of talking about two sides. This is not two sides. This is so much more complex than that. And we can look at it from the humanitarian perspective, in which it's an absolute catastrophe. Save the Children, an international humanitarian organization, has shared that more children have been killed in the past 20 days than were killed since 2019 all around the world in armed conflict. Yeah, it's a humanitarian disaster, and it's a man-made disaster, right? It's not just like a hurricane has come through or something. This is completely been engineered and is serving political purposes. And while like the majority of people are, you know, I think the majority of people do have universal values that could be shared. It is also true that for decades, there has been work to really create divisive environments in both of the countries, you know, in Palestine and in Israel. And amongst Palestinians, the seeds of that have been sowed by Israel and by Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu. And for decades, Hamas and Gaza has been engineered to be a place in which people would have no other choice but then to resort to violence. And it is very well known, anyone who takes politics 101 or studies just a little bit and asks the question of like, well, how do you get terrorists in the world? And first of all, the word terrorist is a word that has been created by the West to deem certain people who are using armed resistance for their liberation struggles to be othered. So, you know, you often hear Palestinians say, who's the terrorist? You know, really, when you look at these governments and the havoc that they're wreaking in the world and on people, and you look at, you know, small groups of fighters and what they're doing, though both can be war crimes, it is asymmetrical. The power there. So I think that what you see now in Gaza is that asymmetrical power playing itself out. I mean, the atrocities that were committed by Hamas are no short of massacres with intent to create genocidal fears amongst people. And what Israel is doing, the collective punishment that has been ongoing for 17 years with the blockade of Gaza, as well as the most recent acts denying people food, water, and electricity, and bombing civilians. These are also war crimes, and these also show, you know, the ethnic cleansing, I think, is a really appropriate term at this point to use, as well as the potential genocide that they are enabling. That the US is enabling and that Israel is perpetrating. So we can just look briefly, you know, to Martin Shaw. He's a genocide scholar, and he shows us very clearly how what happened in Ukraine, you know, when you had what happened in Ukraine, the US and many Western allies were very quick to call this genocide. But now they will not even call for pausing and for a ceasefire. So, you know, what we see here is racism. And what we really have to confront, I think, particularly as Americans, is decades and, you know, in a longer colonial history of demonizing and dehumanizing Arabs. And so when they show up on our screens and their little bodies being blown apart, we've already seen it thousands of times. And we think that the Middle East is just constantly in a conflict. And this has been going back since the time of Ishmael and Isaac. And there's nothing that can be done about it. That is absolutely not true. There is international law that is incredibly important that we have come up with as humanity after the Holocaust, and which should be respected, especially by the country who has the most military power by far of any in the world. There is no question that this is actually designed to show once again that the United States, Israel, and other actors like Russia don't have to abide by international law, and there will not be consequences, not from their people and not on the international legal level.
So I have to step back and ask this one question. When you started, you were talking about terrorists and resistance fighters. So are you alluding to the Hamas are freedom fighters, or Hezbollah? They are resistors or freedom fighters?
I'm not am I alluding to that? You know,
Are you classifying that group
I'm
of
not
people?
classifying that as
Okay.
I'm not classifying anyone here. It is very clear that the Palestinian that these Palestinian fighters, who, by the way, 95% of them are recruited when their families have been killed by Israel, they are recruited into armed struggle in this wing of Hamas. There is 25 to 30,000 of those people amongst a population of 6 million. When we think about the amount of people who actually committed the atrocity and went in and did what they did in Israel, it's even smaller than this 25 to 30,000, right? So while it is a war crime and it is heinous and, all of these different things, the conditions for creating that have been long known and have been supported by Israel. We all know that that is what happens. That is what happens to you and anyone else if you will live under those conditions, and you will have to make choices where you have no employment, where your family is near starving, and this is the only thing that you can do. So does it really matter if they're freedom fighters or they're terrorists? Palestinians would say, yeah, it's a shame many Palestinians would say it's a shame what they've done, and they have really hurt our cause in the world because they are primarily, for decades, nonviolent. They are super incredible nonviolent activists and diplomats and have done everything in the world system to show you how nonviolent they are. The fact that people continue to concentrate on this small group and these incidences is really missing the point.
Yeah, and I mean, I wonder, yeah, I think it is missing the point. And I think, John, kind of just in hearing both of you, like, I get the propaganda in terms of like just demonizing an entire people, that their only recourse is to do something.
Yeah, I've never seen that before.
Yeah. And I'm like, I feel like, I think I've had this conversation a lot in the past 20 days with a lot of different people, and I have a lot of people that are very pro-Israel that I talk to, and like there's a big assortment, right? And I'm just trying to understand, and I often come at it from like really trying to understand, and a lot of things, because I don't necessarily feel like we can present that perspective. For personally, I don't present that perspective, but a lot of things that I've heard and having conversations with people that are pro-Israel, and a lot of things you hear on the news, the story of like, oh, well, we can't let in food because Hamas will take it, or power because Hamas will use it, or we can't help these people because it's giving money to the terrorists, it's giving resources to the terrorists. We can't let these people through the borders because what if one of them are the terrorists? And you're saying this is like 0.005% of the people that live over there, which is like nothing,
and that's collective punishment, and that is and that is one of the parts of genocide. So when you make that argument, you're supporting the argument of collective punishment. And so it's, this is just not acceptable. It's unfortunate, but when we get in the black and white thinking, right, we think that we have to do that. We have to say, all the people are like this or all they're like that. No, it's not true. It's not fair. If one American goes in and shoots a group of people, you know what Israel would do in that case? They would go to his home and they would demolish his home and leave his entire family with nowhere to live, and imprison his brothers and his family members and deny them access to travel because of what one person did. So collective punishment in Israel is systematic at a very small level and at a much larger level. And there will be no peace without accepting the fact that these kinds of violent situations do happen on the way to that. But you cannot not give people their human rights just because that is a possibility that will happen.
Those are all, they're legitimate reasons, but they're all this bullshit, because the bottom line is that you cannot say that the majority of the people are like that, because they're not, and it's pretty evident that they're not. And so therefore humanitarian aid is something that you're supposed to do. I I think one of the things that really confuses me, and it bothers me too, is that what are the other Arab nations doing about this? Because it would seem to me that the collective weight of all those countries working together should be able to make things a little bit easier as far as what's going on right now. I mean, at least as far as getting humanitarian aid, whatever. I mean, I don't understand. It's like everybody is sitting back watching what's going on between Hamas and Israel, and nobody's doing it. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody's got an opinion about it, but nobody's doing anything. I don't
do you
get
think
that.
it's because because of the US backing Israel and kind of being the larger hand in it, and no one wants to.
Well, as much as these other countries talk shit about, the United States being our big brother and always bullying everybody else, and we're going to stand up for ourselves or whatever.
The most important thing for them is their political interests. They have already gone through and abandoned Palestinians in the past decade mercilessly,
right,
and have made alliances with Israel and the United States that are primarily economic and military alliances. And so despite the fact that the populations of their countries absolutely want them to support Palestinians, that is not their priority. Their priority is a geopolitical conversation that they're in. And, that's also, we haven't talked about that, but that is also what is going on here. I mean, this is, Hamas is supported by, and one of the satellites of Iran. You have Hezbollah, you have the Muslim Brotherhood throughout the region. And
the Houthis
and so,
in Yemen as well.
Yeah, and also in Yemen, exactly. So you have, I mean, I don't want to go on too much here, but
going.
Okay,
yeah.
keep going. Yeah. So you have, and also the relationship between Iran and Russia and China is all playing out here so this is an environment in which that gets to express itself, and Palestinians and Israelis are the kindling for their fires, so the US relationship with Israel and the alliance isn't just based off of some romantic story of how much we love the Jews. It's not about that. It's a military strategy, and it's to continue to have domination and control over resources and over the political context in the Middle East.
The saddest thing that
let's
I
assume
heard about this particular subject was when Jon Stewart made the comment that nobody gives a fuck about the Palestinians but the Palestinians. There's nothing in it for anybody else in the world except for what you're saying about as far as geopolitical, their aims and goals and pitting each other against each other. There's nothing in it to make things better for the Palestinians except for the Palestinians, because nobody else gives a shit.
Yeah.
So let's assume for a moment that that the US says, hey, you know what, guys, screw you, we're not going to support you anymore. What do you think would happen in Israel and Gaza?
I don't think that's necessary, and that is even on the table. So I don't really see the reason for discussing it.
Well, because we just talked about it. You talked about it a few minutes ago.
No, I'm sorry. I really want to be clear about this.
Okay.
We're not in a theoretical landscape right now. This is a real situation happening. And it's not possible that the US will just break all of their trade agreements. I mean, that's, so there's no reason to even discuss that. The truth of what the US needs to really do is what's important here. And what the US needs to do absolutely is call for a ceasefire immediately and ensure that the humanitarian conditions for a war that is within the boundaries of international law is established. They are setting a very dangerous precedent all around the world that international law should be disregarded. And though they've been doing that for decades, this is another level of that. So again,
how can you speak out against what Russia's doing in Ukraine if you allow this to happen in Gaza? And I've said that from the beginning, and I totally agree. And I don't think it's time to speculate about possibilities that can't happen. I think there's
but hear me out, okay? So as you said, so the US calls for a ceasefire and says to Netanyahu, hey, we want you to call for a ceasefire. We want you to stop this. Or
the funding is conditioned. You cannot use these weapons, and you cannot use our funding to violate international law and to commit war crimes and cause genocide.
Okay, and you think that he would then say, oh, okay, yeah, you're right. I'm going to stop this.
If the funding is conditioned, he will greatly change his strategy. There's no question about that.
Okay, so it is a real possibility. It is not a theoretical. That's the point that I was trying to make.
Well, no, you said to withdraw all of our support, which would never
Right.
happen.
Yeah. But I'm saying
to
that,
condition our military funding, I think we could do that. And what do you think in terms of like, do you think that, doing what we can, like protesting, marching, posting on social media, pressuring our elected representatives, like doing everything we can as American citizens to tell our government that we don't support this? Like, do you think that that's an active strategy?
Yes,
what we can do?
Yeah, I mean, Gabby, do you want to respond to this?
Sure. I can add a little bit, but please feel free to add more color. I do think it's a helpful strategy. I do think that the amount of awareness that people have around the Palestinian cause and their history and people advocating for them is heartening to the people who are there and people who are part of their diaspora, to make them feel like they actually are seen and that people do care about them, and that they are human. I think Allison could add a lot more here in terms of other potential solutions here, but I think boycotting and divesting from different organizations that are in support of what's happening, and are funding what's happening in Israel are super impactful as well. Like hitting, especially with these large corporations, hitting them in their wallet really changes the way that they go about their strategy and the way that they approach things. I think
What's an example of like hitting large corporations? Because that's kind of intangible for me.
Sure. Well, the one that's been actively being done is boycotting McDonald's and Starbucks lately. I think Disney as well, Disney Plus, getting people to cancel their Disney Plus subscriptions for funding Israel. And I mean, the same kind of idea parallels with healthy food options in McDonald's. Like McDonald's wouldn't offer healthy food options if it wasn't for there being demand for that, right? So they started providing salads and other opportunities for people to have healthier food options because demand was there. And so the market adapts based on what people are demanding, what the people are demanding. And so that's in part how I've been looking at it. And maybe Allison, if you want to add more of like what happened in South Africa or different cases in which this has actually been impactful, that might be helpful to add to the conversation.
Yeah, sure. I mean, boycott is a strategy that has, primarily it's important that it's called widely for by Palestinian civil society and by the grassroots movements for Palestinian liberation. And the idea, there are many corporations who also have their products and made in settlements, and the European Union has at least gone to the point of labeling that. So when you buy things, you know the difference between something that's been made in a settlement or made within 1948 or what is called Israel. And but I think more on the institutional level, we really need to be pushing for. And, we do exist within different companies and corporations. We, as employees, we can be activists as members of religious institutions who have endowments, or as we've seen most popularly, academic institutions. Students have been really for a decade organizing to have their academic institutions divest from corporations that are perpetuating the occupation. So the occupation and apartheid. So it's not about, I think people get really, they think, like you were saying, John, that we're not, that it's like about cutting off all support to Israel. And it's not about that. It's about conditioning. and about certain types of relationships that are acceptable to have and other ones that are not acceptable to have. And I think that's responsible behavior. That's responsible friendship. That's responsible relationships with our colleagues and with everyone in the world. So it does go from the personal to the political realm. And I think that's something we really have to recognize, that and it's also not just going to be about calling your senator right now and donating money right now. You have to figure out a way to run your life so that you can make a lifelong commitment to ensuring human rights in the world. And you have to devise real things that you do in the world to do that. A combination of education and activism and advocacy. And, you have to, as a person, decide, just as you do things for your mental health or your physical health or the care of your family members, you have to take that into your life as something you do it.
So we have to convince our political or politicians in this country that we are serious about how we feel about this, right?
Yeah, it has to be on the agenda, and it's actually really
here's
easy.
Why that won't work. All right, I'm not trying to be a smartass or anything like that.
No,
I'm just being real. We've had over 600 mass shootings in this country. 80% of our population wants something done about that, some kind of gun control, something that will eliminate or help eliminate that. And our politicians are just telling us. So we have to find some other way to convince them that if they don't do this shit, I mean,
in that same regard, John, like, we just had elections yesterday, and all states that had human rights on the ballot in terms of abortion law voted to protect women's rights. So yeah, I do feel like people do vote, and we can elect representatives that will support the laws that we want. And and it's a long process. It isn't overnight, but I do feel like
that's the key right there. And that's the point I was trying to get at, is this is something that's going to take generations. This is not something that's going to happen that we will see in our lifetime. We have to be willing to put out the effort so that farther down the road, our children or our children's children will see the benefits of what we're doing today.
Believe it or not, I actually don't think it's going to take generations. I think the end is coming a lot sooner than you think, because I think that the younger generations don't look at things. They're not as brainwashed as we were. And they got us from the very beginning when we were little babies and raised us to believe certain things. I, as a Black man, was led to believe certain things until I got to be a teenager and said, what the fuck? I'm actually believing in the shit that they're teaching me, that I'm not worthy. And then you start looking at all this other stuff and go like, okay, when you start looking at the history and reading things, you realize it's total bullshit. And I think the younger kids now have so much more access to information. Whether they're actually going to do it, I don't know. But I feel they are. I feel they are making the attempt to learn more stuff and not just taking their parents, because if you look at the world right now, this is just my personal opinion, but if you look at the world right now and see how fucked up it is, you cannot be a young kid and say, well, my parents and my grandparents, they must have been right, because look at what all this shit is brought. It's bullshit. So I have to look at things a little bit differently, because that shit's not working. The other thing is that they know nowadays that the two biggest problems with politics in this world are dishonesty and hypocrisy. That's what you're seeing right now, and a
lack of participation.
Yeah, and
when you have less,
it's a lack of participation because of those two things. Because they know that politicians are lying all the fucking time, and they know that they're hypocrites all the time. So I get that.
When you have less than 50% of the registered voters that are participating in an election, that's less than half of the and then when you take that only 60% of the eligible voters are registered, you got 3 people making the decisions for 10. And that's where you two guys come in. What's that?
At least they have the option to do that.
That's correct. And look where it's gotten us.
Exactly. Like when you look at Palestine right now and the situation with Israel and Palestine, you know, Israel is ruling over people who don't have equal rights. It is, you know, you have, and Israel has made the choice that they are willing to put 500,000 settlers in the West Bank and make it impossible to have a two-state solution. It is not about a lack of a Palestinian partner. It is about their creation of what is called facts on the ground that make it impossible to have a two-state solution. And in the meantime, what they do with that is that they deny all of these people the access to voting and to participating in any type of representative government. And so that is why you have Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International saying that, okay, guys, this is apartheid. If you are taking all of this land, and now if you are going to go and you occupy Gaza and you deny all of these people to have the same rights as others, it's an apartheid state. And so I think, you know, you can talk about here again, back to our privilege, right? Like that's a privileged conversation to talk about how people are choosing not to vote. But we are dealing right now with a population that doesn't have the opportunity to vote because Israel doesn't want to have a democratic state. Actually, a democratic state would mean that Jewish people are not going to be in the majority.
Can I stop you there for just a second and ask a question? When you said Israel does not want to be a democratic state, are you talking about the population?
No, of course, like most of the people want to live in a democratic state. I'm talking about the political strategists.
Right. Okay. That was, I just wanted to clarify that because I didn't believe that the Israeli people or the Palestinian people do not want to live in America.
Exactly. Universal
it is not, it is the political leaders of those, you know, and we're facing the same situation in our country that we're a half a step away from, you know, just
you are not facing the same situation. I'm sorry, you are not facing the same situation. It is nothing like what is happening there. This would mean that 50% of the population right now cannot vote and is constantly under military oppression.
I said we're a half a step away from going in that direction.
I don't think you are half a step away in the United States from 50% of the people losing their rights.
But we are heading in that direction.
Yeah,
no, I don't think so.
It's true. We're in
What's that? You don't think so?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think it's bad, and I think it's gotten a little bit worse.
I didn't say it can't be turned around.
But you're talking about such an extreme. I mean, even when they talk about having a new civil war, or race wars, and all other shit, the majority of people don't believe in that bullshit. They just don't. But you know, the reality is, in the Middle East, things are so complex and so ridiculous that you have so many different cultural and historical things and political things smashing each other in the face all the time that it's almost impossible to find a solution because people are afraid of, you know, they're afraid of losing political aid. They're afraid of losing military aid. They're afraid of messing with an alliance or some promise they made to somebody else. They're afraid of losing resources. It's so fucking complicated. It's nothing like the United States. The United States is pretty much cut and dry.
I mean, do you feel like losing, sorry,
Yeah.
do you feel like losing, like you mentioned, like, you know, allowing everyone within Israel occupied territory to vote, that would threaten the balance of, you know, Jewish majority, and like that, and do you think that that's like what's driving it, like the fear
and there's education about this that has gone widely within campus networks. It's called the demographic dilemma, and there's very clear political strategy around this issue, and that is also part of why, you know, slowly but surely, like people in Jerusalem who are born in Jerusalem, they have even a different status. They don't have West Bank or Gazan IDs with the Palestinian Authority. They don't have Israeli citizenship, and if they go to study abroad, they can be like many of them lose their ability to even be as a resident, like have a green card within the place that they were born.
So just like the Eastern Jerusalem settlement that's not considered kind of part of either. It should be, but it's been like just kind of not.
East Jerusalem was annexed. East Jerusalem has been annexed, is what it's called. It's different than the West Bank because many parts of the West Bank have been annexed. If you look at the maps, you'll see like a Swiss cheese when it comes to even worse than that, just crumbs really left of places where governance of the Palestinian Authority is happening.
Talking about East Jerusalem, by the way, you're talking about.
No, there was a point before that was being mentioned that I wanted to come back to, but I am from the conversation right before, but it's okay.
Sorry.
Right, well, I want to jump in real quick and just build off of something that Dirk was saying before about, like, I don't actually think that this needs to take generations. I acknowledge that this is a marathon, and as I mentioned to Allison yesterday when we were talking, it's also a relay race. We're like passing on the baton to the next generation, but and it's going to take, I think, a long time to clean up the messes that we've made as humans with each other. But I also think that we can align and come together around shared goal and purpose much sooner than generations from now. And the record rate at which I see young people who are kind of really waking up and doing their research as to what's happening. Like, there's of course the blessing and the curse of technology. I come from working in the tech sector before I went down this nonprofit path, and I guess if we go back to like early humans and how technology has always been integral into how we've evolved as people, starting with fire and language and the tools that we've created. As we've like kind of evolved and grown, we've outsourced more and more of the things that we used to rely on each other for to technology and to industries and institutions that got created from technology. So rather than handling our conflicts as humans together, well, I'm going to outsource that to the legal system. And I'm going to potentially destroy you, even if you've done nothing wrong, through this tool for manipulation. Which it can be a tool for manipulation. Or we're going to outsource our energy production or food production to these large industries. And it's to the point now where we've outsourced so much of our lives to technology that you actually don't have to physically interact with another person in order to exist, which is
I think one of the
crazy.
reasons why a lot of that's happened, Gabby, is because we outsource because we don't want the responsibility of doing it ourselves. And the people who are doing all that outsourcing, and this is, to me, which is the most tragic thing about politics that I've discovered, is that over the years, when you look at it, being a politician, in the true sense of what being a politician is a very heavy burden. It's a really hard job. But unfortunately, the people who are most drawn to that kind of a job are people who have sociopathic or psychopathic tendencies, because they want to have power, they want to be able to boss people around, they want to have the prestige, they want to make the money, they want the business opportunities, but they don't really want the responsibility of doing what's right. And unfortunately, when you look at American, I'm just using American politics in particular as an example, and you look at American politics over the last few decades, maybe the last 100 years, you've seen it going more and more in that regard, to the point to where we now have politicians that are so fucking stupid, they know nothing about they don't even know their own fucking history, much less the history of something in the Middle East. And people are electing them to be responsible for things that they don't even understand and they don't care about. And so they'd rather outsource it to somebody else, because first of all, that's my buddy and he's going to make more money if he's doing it instead of the government's doing it. And secondly, I don't have the responsibility of worrying about it now anymore. And that's where I see the problem with politics in the world today, especially in this country.
Yeah, that's definitely a problem. Or I will just give my vote to the highest bidder, like whoever has the most money.
And guys, we're running out of time, so we need to speed this up.
Okay.
I want to say one last thing. Okay. I just want you to think about this. From any of us to our grandchildren is 3 generations. That was the point that I was trying to make when I said this is going to take generations.
I got you.
It's not our kids. It's maybe our grandkids, if we're lucky, or their kids.
I didn't mean to hurt your feelings when I said that. I got you.
I'll get you.
That makes sense.
And I also
fair.
I also I also don't think it'll necessarily take that long to be at least on the right track and working together cohesively.
I don't think
as a
everyone
group of
has
people.
equal opportunity to that. I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I just don't think that we can, people who are bombed right now in Gaza, I mean, trauma takes 5 generations. I cannot expect that someone who just experienced the genocide in Gaza and what they're going through is going to be able to sit with the girl in Haifa who, lost a few friends right now. I don't think that, I don't think we can even talk about this. Like it's we are sharing that experience. It is different for so many different people.
I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the reasons why I brought up hypocrisy in politics so much is because I was thinking about what both of you were saying earlier. When you really think about it, the United States is known for generations that if you're going to go and drop a bomb on somebody who was innocent and had nothing to do with it, you're probably doing the best recruiting job for the other side than you could. And you can see this in any conflict in the world, and it's not getting any better. And so it just makes me sad to see what's going on in Gaza today, knowing that if you went in with humanitarian aid, you could literally change the course of history to some degree just by doing that.
It's not about the humanitarian aid, I mean, you would help people to survive, but it's really about the creation of these conditions. You need to end the blockade on Gaza. You need to disengage from the West Bank. You need to give people the ability to govern themselves and to have their own rights, and to do it with equality. With equality, not to be an unarmed group next to one of the countries with the greatest militaries, and the superpower of the Middle East. So international institutions, I think when you talk about humanitarian aid, the piece that's important to me there is that international institutions have a role to play in this, but they have to be enabled by the governments, especially by the United States.
So basically, there's only 2 ways to look at this. Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is basically insanity. So either those countries are doing that, engaging in a form of insanity, or it's something that we want to do, that we mean to do. We're going to continue doing it because it serves our purpose. So you got to look at it one of those 2 ways, the way I look at it right now. So that's all I got to say about that.
I feel like we could keep talking about this for
there's
a
a
long
big can
time.
of worms.
No, we can't.
Yeah, well, we can't talk about it anymore maybe now, but
I just want to wrap up the one point
Please.
that I was trying to make earlier, which is that if we've outsourced all of these aspects of our lives to technology and you don't need people to exist, then really part of the most important work of this time is to learn how to be human together with other people. And there are many things that means: social and emotional intelligence, creation of beauty, of art, of nourishing one another, gathering, getting to the same table and sharing food with each other. I think that's some of the most important work of this time, is all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Gabby.
And with that, let's eat.
Yeah.
I'll play
Thank
a
you guys
song.
so much for being on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
It was a great opportunity for us too. So
I feel like I learned so much, and I would love to have you guys on in the future too, to talk about this in an even deeper way, because I feel like we barely skimmed the surface. And it's Allison, your experience, your firsthand experience and your view is so valuable. I feel, because there's so much out there that how do you know how to trust and who to believe? And there's so much propaganda, and like so many people and are propagandized, and we don't want to accept that we've been lied to. We don't want to accept that the thing we've been believing our whole lives isn't true. We don't want to accept that we're the oppressor. There's so many layers that are hard to look at. And I think that when we all actually can start to look at it, and to also not blame ourselves for being lied to, not blaming ourselves for being manipulated, but also taking responsibility for being in that position and actually changing and being willing to look at where we went wrong. I think this conversation is a really beautiful step in that direction. And so I thank you so much for sharing your perspective. And I also thank you too so much, Gabby, for sharing your perspective. I do think, yeah, there's a lot of healing that can be done.
Yeah, and that's what the morning groups are for. You know, the morning groups that we've been holding, and I will share with you all a link that you can share as well for that, is a space where we can really come together and hold the complexity and to be in the emotional space, because to go through, you know, that long journey that we all are on right now together, really, it does require commitment and a softness and tenderness.
And as the oldest person in this group, I'd like to say to Gabby and Allison, don't lose your passion for what you're doing.
Thank you.
And with that, I think we are done.